right, good morning. We are going to continue talking about populations. Today we're going to be looking at population dynamics. That basically within this chapter includes dispersal, how populations move in a ecosystem, metapopulations. We can kind of view small populations that do move about. We call those metapopulations, so we'll talk a little bit about that. You can see patterns of survival, age distributions, and rates of population change. And so those are the parameters that we will be discussing today. So in talking about population dynamics, right, we're looking at how individuals move in or move out of a particular area. And they do that basically one of two ways. You can see there birth and death, right? New individuals coming in, being born into the population or dying again in that population unit. Or we have individuals moving from other populations into the given one of study or moving out of that unit that you are focusing on. So the equation that we have here is n at a given time. So nt would be the time now, so the size of the population right now, equals nt minus 1, which basically means some previous time before, right? If you want to look at how much change has occurred in the last year, it'd be a year ago. If you want to look at how much change has occurred in 10 years, right, you would have to know your starting population from 10 years ago, know how many individuals were born into that system, how many individuals died or moved in or moved out between different populations. So that's what we're looking at here. Is NT is a time now. So NT minus 1 is some time before, again, depending on the study. B, you can see, is birth, so individuals born in that population, plus immigration, right? So individuals moving in from another population, minus individuals that have died or ones that have emigrated and have left that given population. This is, again, one of those equations where I want you to know the formula, but I'm not going to give you any math associated with this. So why do individuals disperse? Right? They're looking for a mate. They're looking for food. In some really simple situations, air currents can pick up individuals and move those, right? So here we're basically, if we're talking about dispersal, we're talking about individuals coming into the population or leaving the population. And it could be where, a particular stage of a life cycle is quote unquote the dispersal stage. So some examples here in your textbook, you have a dandelion. I guess probably most of us as kids picked those things up and blew on them, right? The dispersal stage, right? It was really easy to disperse those into your front lawn. But we see this with lots of individuals. So here we have a barnacle, right? And barnacles are usually attached to a substrate like a dock or a boat. But they give off little larvae that are planktonic, right? And kind of float in the water column. Spiders, right? We've all seen them attached to the sides of things, but sometimes they're so small that they can let out a little bit of silk. And again, that can be picked up by the wind and move, right? So it could be in fish. Fish do the same thing, right? Fish eggs in the water column. Right, lots of reasons why populations or individuals would move to various little parts of the ecosystem and move between populations. So there's a couple terms when we are talking about populations where individuals are what we call native, where the presence in the area is the result of natural processes. So whether it's, plate tectonics and things moved over long periods of time, but native basically means we expect those type species or populations or the size of the population in those given areas. Non-native are individuals or species that have come from outside of the normal range into those given areas. Now, the term non-native doesn't say how those organisms moved into those different areas. Two words we can kind of use to expand on that is introduced. An introduced species, basically, it's in that area because we as humans have moved them in there. Now, the term introduced isn't good or bad, right? It just says we have moved these things from point A to point B. Invasive is where we take that a step further and say, okay, we introduce them, they're not native to that particular area. Oh, and they're bad, right? What makes them bad could be for a variety of reasons. They could damage the ecosystem, the environment, right? Maybe they feed on other species. Maybe they outcompete. Maybe they are more efficient in the ecosystem than a native population, right? And so it could be they're just invasive to the given ecosystem that is right there. Now, on the backside of this is the human economy or human health, right? If we have brought mosquitoes and various parasites and diseases into new areas, which we have done all throughout history, right? We can definitely see how that can affect human health. Human economy kind of goes with the human health, but not necessarily. Obviously, if you're having to put research and funds into managing, fire ants in your front yard and you have allergies to being stung by them, obviously there is going to be an economic association with that. That being said, the human economy, we could also look at it from trying to eradicate agricultural pests. Right. And so maybe there's not a human health importance to that, but there is definitely an economic importance to that. Why do we see such drastic rates of expansion with invasive species? Well, we just took something from outside of the population into a brand new environment. And the possibilities are either thrive in that new environment or die off because the resources that you need aren't there, right? So the reasons why we see invasives be so effective is because of multiple different things, and I've kind of listed some here. If they move into, right, we're talking about dispersal. So if we move into a new population and they are successful, usually they have a high ability to disperse, right? If they didn't, they would die off. Again, they're a new habitat, they're thriving. Usually these organisms, they're not selective. They can tolerate a wide range of either environmental conditions or maybe food sources, right? So they have a high habitat tolerance. They can deal with all sorts of things. If they're very specific in where they wanted to be and they found themselves outside of those parameters, right, they wouldn't be successful. Competition. Usually invasive species can outcompete those native species of those given areas. Again, they're somewhere new. Organisms that may used to predate upon those probably didn't move with them, right? If they did, they would not be as successful. So generally, there's no predator, right? And we've seen this in lots of situations where we have found invasive species that some studies are looking at, okay, well, let's go back to the ecosystem they came from, see what predators they have in those systems, and maybe bring those predators into the new system to try to manage these individuals. High reproduction rates, and we'll kind of go into some examples here in a little bit, but if they have the ability to produce faster, life cycles are faster than native species, right? Their populations are going to go up much, much faster as well. And if they grow faster, right? If they go into a new population, their reproduction rates are higher, and it takes less time from them to go from egg to adult, right? They're obviously going to be more of them faster to outcompete those native populations. And so now we can look at and go into a couple different examples.
All right, so just these are some examples that are in your textbook. So this image is, like I said, from your textbook. So Africanized honeybees, they are native to Africa and Europe. They were actually hybridized. In Brazil, conditions are a little bit different. So they were hybridized to basically take kind of the characteristics of both populations and kind of breed a new organism that would be great for that environment. And so what we found is they're great for the environment. They can tolerate the conditions down in Brazil. However, they're definitely more aggressive when we find them in high populations. And so that's what we're finding. I remember when I was a kid, so if you look at the time frame, kind of, 70s and 80s, which was when I was a kid, this would be on the news. The Africanized honeybees are coming, and it was kind of scary. If you were watching the news, the bees are coming, the bees are coming. Thankfully, they are here, but luckily they haven't taken over the native honeybees to the extent that they alluded that might actually happen. But you can see dispersal. So they were introduced late 50s, and within 50 years, they had migrated all the way up. So pretty quick as far as reproductive processes go. But thankfully, we don't see them in the vast populations that we thought that they were going to be in. So we talked a little bit about zebra mussels. So you can see here the concentration early on was found around the Michigan lakes. And so that's where zebra mussels were brought in, like I said, from the Black Sea. And you can see how they basically just started dispersing through the river system. You can see that they have now made their way all the way across the US. Why might you have a really heavy population here and then one little dot over here? How do you think that might happen?
They travel through the Mississippi River, and then maybe somebody took, I don't know, a boat. Oh, no, never mind.
So yeah, boat, absolutely. So when you see the signs on the side of the road that says, drain dry, stop, drain dry your boat, this is exactly why we see that. These movements over here are probably more natural, that these mussels are naturally moving through those river systems as they are connected. And where we start seeing these little dots kind of dispersed off to the side where there's no actual connectivity, and that's a result of human interaction. Now, this was initially human interaction bringing them over, but then they naturally moved about. So there is a question at some point in time, when does a population or a species become native to an environment? We talked about native being naturally in that area, non-native being introduced, but at what time has something established itself long enough that it would be considered native? And that's kind of still one of those question marks. We've seen lots of examples of organisms that have been in a quote unquote new area, even for like 100 years. And so at what point is it natural? So the murder hornets are up in Washington. They are not here. Luckily, there's not that many.
It's not yet.
I would love to find one, but that's just me.
Me too. I've been waiting this whole time.
You know, there's plenty of things here in Texas. If you want to get stung by something, there's plenty of things that are around here that'll hurt equally as much. So I know the tarantula hawks are here all the time. I see them in my front yard. You want to have a painful experience. Tarantula hawk is a 4 out of 4 on the pain index scale. So
Have you seen that YouTube channel of this guy? His whole existence is literally traveling around the world to get stung by the most painful animals. And he got stung by the murder hornets in Japan, and like his arm literally swole up like 3 times, and they needed to take him to the hospital.
I don't know if we're talking about the same guy, but there is a professor at the University of Arizona, Justin Schmidt, and his whole research is on, stings. Generally, he's looking at hymenopterans, so wasps, bees, and ants. But his whole research is based on that. His is not for entertainment, but that's his research.
My 8-year-old sister watches that guy. I think his name is Coyote Peterson.
Yes, that's him. That's him. Crazy
Yeah.
dude. Oh,
Yeah,
him and his
he's
girlfriend.
crazy.
I'm getting a life insurance policy out on him.
All right, complete side note, but do you know where the worst place to be stung is?
Your
In his
eye?
Nope.
Your tongue?
Your neck.
Nope.
Toes?
Hands.
Anywhere in the private parts? I don't know.
Nope.
Ear?
So nope, there was a guy, I think Cornell maybe. So he did his dissertation thesis, I don't know which it was. He took honeybees, so honeybees just to be a standard, and intentionally stung himself in various parts of the body, scored it, did it in replicate at 10. So he got stung in each place 10 times, and the worst place is on the inside of your nose.
This is maybe a little TMI, but whenever it gets cold, I tend to get cold sores in my nose, and they're very painful.
So yeah, so there is a whole science into insect venom and stings and such. So as far as the Schmidt pain scale, it's at a 4. The bullet ant, which is the worst, is down in South America, is a 4. But the one that's relatively close is the tarantula hawk that we have here in Texas. So do not get stung by one because your whole arm would go numb. So do not. If you see them, they're pretty. Don't mess with them because she will come after you. And
That's the scale where it says like just sit down and cry because it hurts.
yeah. If you get stung by one, it's best. If you get stung by one, it's best to sit down because otherwise you will fall down, and the fall is probably going to be worse than you just sitting down and crying. So yes. I would seek medical attention, but you're probably going to crawl and not walk. So, all right. So again, kind of talking about how do we track changes in dispersal in given populations. And so if we're doing this over, thousands of millions of years, we can look to lake sediments, right? And so we can look to how populations have moved over time in relation to climate change, right? We know that there's been glaciers that kind of come down and then they recede. And so we can look to how organisms have responded over the years. And then that way, as we're seeing kind of some climate change currently, we can make predictions and estimations based on our records, right? And so we can look to something like lake sediments when we're trying to track plant populations or how plants have, moved about. So when I asked earlier, why do organisms disperse? One of the first things you guys told me was looking at relationships with food, right? And so we can look at basically predator-prey ratios and look at that relationship. And so what we generally find is, so this is a little vole right here, as a vole population decreases, the predator population, whether it's owls or some sort of kestrel or bird, those populations also decline. So why would we see similar population relationships between predator and prey populations?
Because one depends on the other.
Right, one depends on the other. If you have a bunch of predators with no prey, what happens to the predator population?
They start to die off unless they can find
Right,
another.
they start to starve, right? And we talked earlier about energy, right? If you have lack of resources, what are you going to focus on? Are you going to focus on reproducing, or are you going to focus on finding more food? Right? Probably finding more food and not reproducing, hence the population declines. And then as we start to see the, there's here it kind of evens out a little bit, right? We're kind of status quo, so to speak, where basically, they can, feed each other, so to speak. And then we start to see an increase. And again, we can see a reciprocal increase in both these things. And you can see where both the predator and prey population rates follow each other, right? Again, what happens if you have a whole bunch of prey?
You start to have more predators.
You start to have more predators, right? Because there is lots of subsistence available for those predators. So the predator, food resource isn't limiting. So then those predators can then focus on reproduction and producing eggs and such, right? So again, they're not stressed, right? And so you can start thinking of kind of all of those things together. So yes, organisms would disperse because of limited food supply, or they're moving to an area that has an abundant food supply. So either they're leaving because it's bad or moving somewhere because it's good. Because I delayed starting the recording, I'll add the notes so you guys will have access to the beginning of that. Sorry about that. All right, so dispersal in river systems. Can anybody think of any fish species that moves up and down in a river column? Or in
Salmon?
Salmon. Why do salmon move about?
To reproduce.
Right, to reproduce. And have you ever seen how humans help salmon move about? I actually saw this thing where they have these guns.
They use those little, those big tubes,
Yeah,
and
they
they
have
shoot
these
them
big
across.
where they shoot the fish across to help them move and migrate. It's crazy. Anyway, you should Google that. It's kind of entertaining. So the thing to consider is organisms move in an aquatic environment, right? And that's not something we generally, when I asked you guys about dispersal, either you talked about wind, you talked about food supplies, but nobody mentioned anything about in an aquatic ecosystem, right? So when we're talking about dispersal in aquatic ecosystems, you have to think that these organisms are adapted to that environment, right? When we think about something like fish or like salmon that are moving through the water column, they are streamlined, right? They are adapted to get through that water and basically reduce as much friction as possible as they're moving through. Maybe they live on the bottom. Maybe they're attached to some sort of substrate, right? Again, to minimize the amount of water energy that is being forced over them. I being an insect person, I think to something like black fly larvae. Black fly larvae have a little sucker at the bottom of their posterior end that helps attach themselves to that particular substrate. Something like caddisflies create these little cocoons out of the sediment to kind of help them establish themselves to prevent them from kind of drifting off. What happens if we have a flash flood?
They move upstream or downstream.
Because I don't know if they're moving upstream in a flash flood. What is a flash flood?
Is that where the water can't absorb, I'm sorry, the land can't absorb the water fast enough?
Yeah,
So-
so what you end up with, so the land can't deal with the amount of water coming in, and so all of that water is going somewhere. And so a lot of these organisms are adapted to a given amount of water movement, right? And if we, in a given situation, if you have really, really heavy rains, right, you have flash floods, you have mud flows, right, there's lots of different things. Those organisms are not adapted for that much water movement. And so what we find is when we have these massive flash floods, again, not a lot of water. If we cut down a lot of trees, the soil can't absorb as much because the roots aren't there absorbing that material. And all that material has to go somewhere, right? And it's going to take the animals with it. So what we find is in flash flood events, we end up with large numbers of individuals being dispersed downstream. For some organisms, if they get flushed downstream, they kind of will move back upstream. We kind of talked about salmon and things like that. Some fish species would definitely move back to whatever natural habitat if they could deal with the differences in any sort of chemical characteristics. But something like insects, if they get flushed downstream, they're not going to go back upstream. They're just not designed for things like that, especially in the larval stage. A lot of the larval stages of insects have that aquatic form, and they're just not adapted for that much water movement. So when we think dispersal, maybe it's a particular stage, right? We could talk about food supplies. We can talk whether it was human induced or not, right? So when we think of dispersal, we can think of it in lots of different ways and the underlying mechanisms for that dispersal, right? When we talk about movement in populations, we could talk about births and deaths, right? We could look at those rates and what are affecting that, but then also what's moving in, what's moving out, right? And so that's kind of what we've been talking about thus far. So we can also talk about metapopulations. So here we have some butterflies, and you can see here, we have a large population right in this little yellow area. We have a little one here, kind of a medium-sized one, a bigger one, kind of a medium one, a little bit bigger, right? So you can see meadows surrounded by forest. So the forest habitat is not their ideal location. And so they would pretty much hang out in these meadows. Each one of these would be considered a different population. If these butterflies were to stay only in the meadow in which they were born, what could eventually happen?
Inbreeding?
Well, if given a small enough population, yeah, definitely inbreeding.
A new species?
A new species, right? So if we had one population here, one here, probably this is the group that's inbreeding, right? The low one. And you have these other ones. Each one of these could end up being its own species, right? Evolution, if populations become separated, you could have a radiative, evolution event. However, with metapopulations, we have separate populations, but usually there's still a few individuals that will disperse, not the entire population, but usually, you have those individuals that want to get out of mom's house, right? Some are perfectly content staying home. Some need to get out of the house, right? And so same thing, you have a couple individuals that will disperse. And if you have disbursement of individuals, what effect would that have on evolution? Is genetic material being passed in metapopulations?
Yes.
Yes. So not as fast, right? The whole populations are not mingling, but there's enough exchange of material, right? So they're connected by an exchange of individuals. So some genetic material is being passed. And so evolution would be restricted, right? Because you still have some exchange. But with metapopulations, small groups, right? Small populations, but a mixing of individuals. All right, so now that you guys are all ecologists, right, and you want to study populations, we're kind of looking at death rates and birth rates and things like that, right? So we can create what are called survivorship curves, right? Now we'll come back to this idea of few versus many offspring. What are the benefits or challenges to having a few or having many? And we'll talk further about that. But one way we can track, populations is via called a life table. So here we're basically looking at survivorship versus death, right? So the idea here is the number of survivors. So you would have to start with a known population. If you guys want to study the survival patterns of skunks, are you going to know the starting population of skunks? Probably not.
Yeah.
Right. We generally, as ecologists, we're going out, say, I want to study the skunks of Texas. I don't know. And I go out and I start counting, but am I ever really going to know my starting population? In that natural environment, probably not. Now, if I start, raising skunks in my backyard, that'll be fun. I would know my starting population, right? And then I could track it from there, right? Or if I have a nursery full of plants, right? I would have that starting population number, right? And so if I start with 1,000 individuals and then say, okay, I had 200 deaths during that year, and that would leave me, 800 individuals that are 1 year old, right? And then, okay, well, I lost 12 the next year, and so on and so forth. And you could start seeing rates. So if you look at the number of deaths versus age, what could you tell me about the relationship between death and years old? So let me ask you this question. How many of y'all have dogs? Or have had dogs? Or know of dogs? How long do dogs live?
10 to 15 years depending.
Depends on the size of the dog and the breed.
So you're right, there's ranges, but generally, 7 to 10, maybe a little longer, a little less, is probably a good range, right? So we can, the reason why we know that and we can say that is because somebody, has taken the data over long periods of time. They looked at different breeds, right? And what are those average rates? So the reason why you guys can say that is because somebody has done this type of research. Now, what is the average rate, age for sheep? I don't know. Skunks. I don't know, me neither. Now, I can tell you for female tarantulas,
Sheep is about 15 years.
it's 30 years for a female tarantula, right? Again, somebody's gone and done that type research. And so this is the type research, right? You have a starting population and you look at, the rates of death, right? And so you can say, okay, well, if an individual makes it past the first year, their potential for survival is pretty high, right? Because out of 800 individuals, we've only lost 12, right? Now, during that first year, things are pretty rough, right? So if you make it past that first year, you're probably pretty good till you're about 8, right? And that's what you guys just told me about dogs, right? So again, if we make it through that first year, usually you're probably, okay till you're about 10, right? And so again, somebody's put in the time in and done things like this. But this is just one type of survivorship, right? Where basically the elderly are where we see most of the deaths occur. And so we'll kind of come back and look at that here in a second. So there's different ways we can go about this, right? So we've already established if I wanted to study the skunks of Texas, I'm probably going to not know how many individuals are surviving and dying, right? I won't know that necessarily. Now, if you're doing something in a lab, you have that starting population, you can do those type studies, right? But that's probably not going to happen in a natural environment. So that cohort life table is just like the one I was talking about, the survivorship, right? Where all individuals are born at the same time, and we're just looking at how many are dying each year, right? So we can look at those relationships. We can create what is called a static life table. So if we don't know when an individual was born, maybe we can figure out when it died. And so Ashley, are you here?
Yes.
So when you look at a skeleton, how would you determine age of death?
So by the bone structure, there are different areas like in the sockets to see like wear and tear of cartilage, and the fusion maybe in the skull to see how old they are.
Right, so sometimes the length of bones, right? What structure has been developed or hasn't been developed yet, right? Length of horns, right? There's lots of different things that could be indicators that would tell you how old they were when they died, right? And so it's probably more possible for you to find a dead skunk outside, right? You can smell it, as opposed to finding a live skunk. Right. And so you can track different type things depending on your study. And so age distribution, right? You go out and you basically start counting what are the given ages of a different population, because there are different organisms that operate in similar patterns in a given environment. And so we'll start looking at those here. So you don't have to worry about the specifics here as far as numbers of skulls or something like that. What I want you to notice, kind of looking at this, is so in one population, we're talking about high survival among the young, right? So for example, we start with 1,000 individuals, right? And you can see there's a little bit of a steeper drop off. So kind of like the chart we were just looking at. So a little bit of a drop off here between ages 0 and 1. And then what can you tell me about from about 1 to about 8 or 9?
Is this for a specific animal?
No.
Few died.
Few have died, right? And then what happens? Oh, so this particular image is in the textbooks talking about sheep, but it can be lots of different things. So what happens in sheep around the age of 9? So 9 to 11 here.
More die.
Right, the increase of death rates increase, right? And then basically we could see a major drop off between 11 and 12, and then so on. And so looking at this, you can say if you made it through the first year, right, we have a high survivorship among young individuals in a given population. And then once you start reaching a particular age, for this example, sheep, around the age of 9, we start to see increased rates in the elderly population. Can you guys think of any other examples where we see that?
In us?
Right, in humans.
Humans.
Great example, right? We have very few, if you basically make it through the first year, right? You're pretty good. Granted, we have medicines and various hospitals and other things to help with that. But still, if we're young, we have a pretty good chance of survival. And then just, 60, 70, 80, bodies start breaking down, and we see increased death rates, right? And so we as humans would follow this exact trend. The axis here as far as age would change, but the pattern would remain the same. And so we find 3 different type populations when we're talking about survivorship, right? We would be this type 1. Right, what I want you to notice, let me go back 1 slide real quick. You could see that similar trend. Do you guys see that similar trend line? Right. So we would be type 1 survivorship curve. So again, higher mortality in older individuals, so survivorship in younger individuals is high. So the next one here is type 2, which basically runs right through the middle. And this is where it's pretty constant throughout survival. There is no relationship when it comes to age. The example the textbook gives is American robins. I don't fully understand this. I can understand type 1 and I understand type 3 really easily. But how there's no relationship to young versus old, I just can't wrap my brain around that. But basically, regardless of age, you have an equal chance of dying. Lack of resources, predation, and those type things. So type 3. So type 3, you would have high mortality in the young. However, if you make it to a certain age, you're pretty much good for a long time. Bryce, I just opened your picture and that is definitely a tarantula hawk. Or at least the second one. I didn't open the first one yet.
They're both of the same thing, but that's awesome.
Yeah, definitely don't mess with those. So I had one in my backyard, and of course, me being me, I wanted a picture of it. And so I was chasing her around the backyard trying to get a picture of her, and she flew at me. She was like, she had had enough. So yeah, I don't recommend that.
Did you get stung?
No.
Oh, good. Well, yay.
I knew enough to stop.
Somebody had mentioned that you really don't want to get stung by them, but I still really wanted a picture of it. It looked pretty preoccupied with the tarantula, so I was like, it should be fine.
Yeah. The one I was trying to take a picture of, she was hunting, and so she didn't have a tarantula yet. Yeah, bad idea. But all right, so sea turtles. Who can tell me about reproduction process of sea turtles?
They're pretty much on their own once they hatch.
Right, so they're pretty much, once they're out in the sea, they're kind of on their own there. But what happens on the beach?
They get eaten by everything, and it's horribly sad.
Right, but how many eggs does a sea turtle lay?
Is it like 60 or something? Like a big
few, right? Now, what happens when she lays the eggs?
She goes away.
She just takes off, right? She's like, I'm out of here. It's too hot. There's too many predators, right? So Bryce talked about predation. So she basically lays her eggs and takes off. So what can you tell me about the maternal care in sea turtles?
There's like little to none.
Pretty much none, right? See ya, I'm out of here. So what we find is high mortality when we don't see a lot of maternal care in a given population. You have high mortality rates in those young individuals, right? But what happens when a sea turtle, reaches 5 years old? I don't know, I'm picking a number here, 5. So once we have a 5-year-old sea turtle, what is its mortality rates?
I feel like they're pretty low because at that point the turtle's like large enough where a lot of the like smaller predators won't hurt it.
Right. So if we look at the rates of survivors, that curve shallows out quite a bit, right? So we have high survivorship in the elderly in these given populations, right? So if we compare 1 versus 3, what type of maternal care do you have for your offspring? So some of y'all are parents. I know you're all kids of somebody. Did your mom and dad take care of you? You taking care of your kids? Right, we have high maternal care. And so in type 1 populations, we have high survivorship in young because usually we have high maternal care, right? And then once we get old, our bodies basically break down. And then it's something like type 3, you have a lot of offspring all at once, and basically they're kind of on their own. But once an individual reaches a certain age, it pretty has a good rate of survival after that, right? And so that would be example of type 1 versus type 3. Like I said, type 2, it doesn't matter the age, you know, kind of equal chance of death in that particular type. So when we look at age differences within given populations, you have to look at the age distribution. Does each individual in a population have the same reproductive rate? No, right? So we have to look at given populations, right? And so if we look at something, the example I have here from a textbook is we have, you know, down here is basically 0 to 19. You can see large population, but who is reproducing, right? Probably this demographic 40, you know, probably teens, I'm going to assume, right? And so you have a large population that is of reproductive age. When you then account into death rates in those given areas, you have a lot of individuals reproducing, you're going to have rapid growth, right? If you have fewer, right, individuals in that same age group, you're going to have slow growth, right? Are you reproducing, are you out reproducing that initial population? And if you can see here, this population, so Italy is the example, if you are not reproducing enough to replace that initial population, you will have 0 or declining growth, right? And so we can look, you know, at age distribution because you have to think of not everyone is reproducing equally. So, all right, well, I am going to stop here. So with that, do you guys have any questions so far? All right, well, we will continue talking about populations next week.